Well, talking about campaign finance, I would be curious to hear your opinion on the recent 2010 Citizens United ruling,
Mm-hmm.
and then also the Buckley v. Valeo 1974 ruling, which is what led to the rise of lobbyists and
Mm-hmm.
corporations influencing our politics. Do you think that restricting campaign financing restricts free speech, restricts the quantity of speech, which was the main argument?
Yeah, so let's start with Buckley and sort of the idea of political contributions in speech.
Mm-hmm.
And then we could talk about Citizens United, which I think is a misunderstood case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, like fundamentally, I think that expenditures or contributions for or against a political candidate or cause, these are expressive core political speech activities. You could imagine wanting to print a bunch of flyers to advocate for a particular candidate of your choice. That costs money. You mentioned Thomas Paine. I mean, like the lonely pamphleteer at some point expends resources in order to get his or her message out. And the Supreme Court of the United States, correctly in my view, has understood that expenditures on campaigns, both made by candidates and also by individuals supporting those candidates, are not just comparable to, but of the same substance as the expenditures of resources to flyer or to organize a community in favor or against a particular political point of view. So what Buckley versus Valeo considered, and this was a case in the 70s that followed after Watergate, Congress passed comprehensive Federal Election Regulation Act, and
Which established the FEC,
which,
I believe.
among other things, established the FEC. And the act set forth a series of restrictions. First, on the amount of money that individuals and corporations and others could donate to campaigns, limited the amount of money campaigns could spend, and then also imposed limits or considered imposing limits on the expenditures individuals could spend, not as contributions, but as just personal expenditures to influence an election. Buying a billboard or something for your favorite candidate or for...
So not directly working with the campaign, but influencing it indirectly.
That's right. Sort of an independent expenditure, it's called. And the Supreme Court said that, well, you could regulate the contribution because when you make a contribution to a candidate, we're worried about either actual or the appearance of corruption in the form of a quid pro quo, like a bribe. And there's a legitimate government interest in preventing the appearance of a bribe, or in fact, preventing actual bribes. And so for that reason, you could limit the direct contributions that are made to candidates, because those are considered to be the most impactful, which create the most direct connection between a supporter, a donor, and a candidate. But you can't limit the expenditure, and you can't limit an individual's expenditure or the campaign's expenditure. And the rationale had to do with, again, going back to the idea of this is core political speech, and we cannot, even for, there's a passage of the opinion which addresses this, so even for like the aim of trying to level the overall field of speech, to create opportunities for other people to get their message out, you can't suppress some people's speech in order to elevate others. And that insight, to me, reflects our tradition and reflects the values that we have as a community. But again, it's not just that we've always done it this way. I think that it makes sense intuitively that one person's speech is equal to that of another person's, and artificial restrictions on their ability to get their message out rub the wrong way and introduce a type of censorship.
And this was way before social media.
That's right. That's right. And there's all kinds of there's complicated regulations now about like when something like, unearned media can be construed as a contribution or an expenditure or something you have to report or consider. But and this was in a time of predominantly print and broadcast. Citizens United considered a portion of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, the McCain-Feingold bill. And specifically, it involved a restriction on whether a corporation could create an independent expenditure within a certain amount of time of an election. And the Supreme Court held it was basically a media regulation. It was more of a media law than a campaign finance law. But the court held, in a controversial opinion, that I think ultimately, as a First Amendment practitioner, I think was correctly decided. The court held that the ability of a corporation to expend money from its general treasuries couldn't be limited even for political purposes, if they wish to use those funds for political purposes. Corporations indisputably have speech rights. They not only have constitutional rights, they have speech rights. Yeah. The New York Times Corporation is the publisher of the New York Times. They have speech rights. Bantam Books, right? That's a corporation. They have speech rights, and those are two of the most important cases during the heyday of the Warren Court, establishing the breadth and rigor of First Amendment protection. There was an argument that, these corporations, they have money in their treasuries because of products that they sell or services they provide. No one gives them money. I don't buy a toothbrush because I like the way that Crest is going to, or Johnson & Johnson or whomever is going to spend money to influence elections. But it's it's not a function of how they obtained their resources. It's a function of whether they can use those resources to express themselves. Mm-hmm. The solution to that type of concern, by the way, is not to patronize businesses whose speech you don't approve of. And so there's a perfect First Amendment response. For example, people just, maybe don't want to go to Chick-fil-A because they disagree with Chick-fil-A's approach to homosexuality and same-sex marriage, and maybe they oppose the sort of Christian conservative viewpoint of that corporation generally. People don't advertise on Fox because they don't support its message. There are First Amendment solutions. It's just not to patronize the business. And so the Supreme Court sort of rejected that argument and overturned a prior case, which said that these concentrations of wealth in some ways are distorting and unearned. So, the empirical data, there was an essay by Floyd Abrams in 2019 on this, and I'll let you get to the next subject, but I was just reading this actually. Floyd Abrams, who's a legendary First Amendment lawyer, wrote an essay in 2019 in which he found that in the wake of Citizens United, corporate political spending didn't shoot up through the roof. It remained more or less the same. Individual super PACs, people before he passed, like Sheldon Adelson, Bloomberg, right? The individuals made massive, like $100 million contributions to super PACs, but that had nothing to do with Citizens United.
Well, Citizens United led to the increase in super PACs.
There was a case called Speech Now, which was decided by the D.C. Circuit, which held that super PACs could raise an unlimited number of, which said PACs, independent expenditure committees, could raise an unlimited number of money and spend an unlimited. They already could spend an unlimited amount of money, but this said you could raise an unlimited amount of money. And I think, again, it's hard to say how that's incorrect. I think that if you accept the premise that an individual has the right to expend resources on an election in any way that they choose as a matter of fundamental speech, joining together with others in a corporate entity, because a corporation at the end of the day is just a group of people who create a
product or service.
Not even. It's an association. It's like a partnership that has a special legal characteristic, and the legal characteristic isn't particularly relevant to the way the money is spent. It just is a way to organize a bank account and collectively hold a bank account in a way. Is if an individual could spend any amount of money that they want, why can't they spend any amount they want to support in confluence with others and pooling their money together and then having that entity take the pooled funds from that single bank account and influence elections? I'm not saying that these are good things by themselves. There should be...
Well, that was my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Doesn't that go against the mission of Govern for California, to represent the public interest, to represent the majority?
I think that it certainly raises the risk that you would have people who will use these vehicles to influence elections in ways that are privately interested. But again, that is the challenge of our system of government. Is at some point there's you have to summon for yourselves the restraint not to abuse the rights that you possess and the powers that you have. And what Govern for California's philosophy is again consistent with, I think, the idea of America, which is that these factions are going to exist. Super PACs are going to exist. Yeah. People with wealth, as we, if our economy continues to produce unequal gains, you will have large concentrations of wealth, and people will use that wealth to influence politics. The solution is not so much to squelch the speech; it's more speech. It's to bring together people who want to speak in favor of the public interest, and to use these same neutral tools, vehicles for expression and influence, to bring to bear influence on behalf of the public. And that's the approach that Govern takes. And I think that's the approach that the First Amendment and the Constitution requires. And again, it ultimately turns on finding people of goodwill who are willing to be philanthropic with their wealth and sort of use it to advance policies that maybe don't line their own pockets, but are the right thing to do. I can tell you, I don't think anyone in Govern for California had any direct material remunerative benefit from enabling nurses in rural parts of the Central Valley to expand their scope of practice. But it was the right thing to do, and it helped a lot of people.
I actually agree with you on the point that we shouldn't be restricting the amount of funds that is spent on campaigns. But I think that we should break the bond between the donors and the politicians and the campaigns. Right now you have lobbyists that have a significant influence on politics and policy making. And if we anonymize donations,